Hello and welcome to another episode of Team English Talks. This time we will be talking about the love poetry within the Eduqas poetry anthology that Year 10 and Year 11 are so lucky to read and to study. With me I've got Mr. Steele.
Hello.
Miss Dales.
Hello.
Miss Dodd.
Hello.
And Mr. Bruff.
Hi.
And I'm Miss Owens. So, okay, let's start off with Mr. Steele. Why do people write love poetry?
Because it's love, innit? No, it's the stereotypical thing, isn't it? You know, I think a lot of people, when they first think about poetry, they think about love and, you know, expressing your innermost feelings and using words to create these images to, shall we say, articulate your own deep-rooted feelings, be they positive or negative, because let's not forget we can have negative love poems. And I think it's one of the most stereotypical and easiest things, I think, to latch onto as a poet, isn't it? Because we've all experienced love in some form, haven't we, apart from Mr. Bruff? As a child who was starved as love.
Like Scrooge.
I would like to see more sort of opening up of love poetry, like love poetry to my cats. You know, an appreciation of how much I love them, and love poetry to
Friends.
Yeah. And,
but I think that's why it is accessible, isn't it? Because it doesn't necessarily have to be a relationship love, does it? You know, it can be, everyone experiences those sorts of affection for various things in life.
In fact, isn't that probably where it stems from? It comes from unrequited love. If you go back far enough to Petrarch and co, who kind of set a lot of the love poetry in stone, it's a love that's not necessarily returned. So it's that, like you said, it's that way of expressing something.
And if you're writing love poems to cats, then it's quite obviously not returned.
Yeah, it's unrequited.
No, especially when they decide to do a poo on your duvet at 6:30 on a Monday morning. But we won't go there. I won't write a poem about that. So, anyway, speaking of somebody who didn't have a very good childhood and didn't have much fun, should we start off with Sonnet 43 then?
Yeah. What a great segue into it.
I feel like I should just qualify that I was being a horrendous person then, and actually Mr. Bruff experienced a very loving childhood, and I was just being
Mr.
obtuse.
Bruff is
I didn't really get it.
loved.
I just thought it was funny.
That's because he always knew love.
Yeah, it's like Tiny Tim of the department, aren't you?
Nah.
Everybody loves you, bless her. Anyway, right. Sonnet 43, and does anybody want to explain about the form of sonnets, the
Shall we jump
purpose
into
of a
the context
sonnet,
first? Because you were
and
saying
then have a
about
look at
how
the-
she
yeah.
shouldn't have a great upbringing.
have a look at the... have a look at the
Poor
context
Elizabeth.
first then.
Who wants to jump in on?
I mean, obviously, she's one of these that suffered under the rule of her father. You know, and when we talk about unrequited love, this is not necessarily unrequited love, but it's almost a bit of a forbidden love, isn't it?
Yeah.
With Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert Browning. You know, almost, I think, and it comes across in the language quite a lot as well, in that she seems like a big fan of him, and it's almost like, you know, fangirl poetry as well. You know,
She's a big fan of him. Put that in your exam. She's a big fan of him.
Mr. Bruff, I don't appreciate you being so cutting on the podcast.
You just said he had a terrible childhood.
You can tell we're recording this on a Friday and not on a Wednesday, can't you?
I think this is quite sad in a way, because you can tell, like, he's her first love.
And she's naive to the world around her because she's been kept under lock and key basically by her dad.
Yeah, and she's met like pretty much probably the first decent bloke that's around there.
Or
And
possibly just the first person who's shown her a bit of interest.
Yeah,
You just can't tell. This is the problem.
And he's much older than her.
Yeah.
She sees him as this like worldly experienced man, you know. It's
yeah, and he lets her be who she wants to be, and
there's maybe a meeting of the minds as well as the kind of feelings, because obviously Robert Browning is also literary, he's also a writer, so maybe for the first time Elizabeth feels like she's seen and understood by somebody else, you know, who recognises that she's creative as well.
Yeah, and at that time in her life, she probably would have given up on the idea of love or you know, of marriage or anything like that, and then suddenly this whole new opportunity opens up to her, and not only is she allowed to write, she's encouraged to write, she's encouraged to speak her mind, she's encouraged to travel, you know, suddenly everything opens up, and you get this in this first rhetorical question, you know, how do I love thee? And then let me count the ways. Like, she's really indulging herself in this sense of, you know, I want to spend time thinking about this. I want to list all of the ways. I want to sort of try and articulate how much this person means to me. So I think, you know, I like that as an opening.
I think this is one of those ones that you always struggle to truly get students to appreciate, because none of them have ever experienced love like this.
Yeah, the strength of an idolatrous love.
Well, hopefully none of them have been locked in a room long
exactly.
enough
True.
and then
Yeah.
just let
Yeah.
out, and they love the first person that comes anywhere near them.
But they don't appreciate that idea of having someone in your life who means so much to you that you feel like you can barely articulate your love for them.
Yeah.
Which obviously comes across in this poem, but, you know, quite often our students might sit there and just be like, she just loves him, doesn't she? Just a bit sad in it, writing this poem. Like, that's quite often a response to
and
it.
I just love, like, she clearly enjoyed writing this, because you get all this sort of religious imagery of the being and the grace and the praise and the faith, and God chose, you know, that idea that it was almost fate for them to meet, and that she's being blessed by God, by his you know, his presence, which, you know, there's a lot of idolatry, isn't there? But then there is if you think about modern love songs, there's an awful lot of idolatry there as well, isn't there?
Fatboy Slim nailed it. I have to praise you like I should.
That was Mary. Fatboy Slim did say, well, actually it was Faith Evans said, I never knew there was a love like this before. I was going to mention him earlier, but unfortunately it didn't seem like the appropriate juncture.
No, I mean, maybe. I mean, look at something like Taylor Swift's lyrics. Maybe they should be included in the anthology, sort of, you know, in years to come.
I don't want to articulate my
no.
thoughts on
I
Taylor
don't
Swift
think
for fear of getting egged in my classroom or something by some vindictive Swifties.
Right.
But,
I hope Miss Weston isn't listening.
Let's focus on that idea about how does she show that she is idolatrous then. So you mentioned obviously all the references to religion and faith. She also chooses a very specific form of poem. And like you said, you know, first time she's being encouraged to express how clever she is. She's being encouraged to express how well read she is. She chooses a different sonnet form to the other poets. She chooses the Petrarchan form. So, you know, your context, which you will be using with your anthology, you've got Petrarch, who's a classical writer, and he crystallises the Petrarchan sonnet form, which is different to the Shakespearean sonnet form. And Petrarch is known for expressing an idolatrous, worshipful form of love. His form of love was never returned by Laura, and that was sort of normal for his era. Men were supposed to worship these high female figures from afar, and obviously Elizabeth's love is returned. Like you said, it's forbidden rather than unrequited. But she's specifically choosing a rhyme scheme here that readers of the canon at the time and the object of her affection, Robert, will recognise. Oh, she's showing me a form of worship here. She's showing me a form of praise by choosing that specific form and that specific rhyme scheme. You know, you need to be recognising that you've got a sonnet in front of you here, and it does follow very specific, strict rules. And she's using those not to constrain herself, but rather to reflect, oh yeah, I want to be part of this canon of super famous, praiseful poetry that places the object of my affection on a pedestal.
And are you sort of suggesting the idea is that this is a form more associated with the male poets of the day?
Yeah, absolutely. Petrarch was a man, and it was usually men who were supposed to express that kind of idolatrous love. It was not meant to come from the female. They were meant to just be the object of affection. So she's maybe reflecting the fact that she is breaching her father's control of her, and she's being a little bit radical by choosing to express herself the way that a male normally would.
It's quite interesting from a feminist point of view as well, isn't it? That idea that she is sort of pushing the boundaries. And I love this idea that, you know, she says, I love thee freely. That sense of freedom as well that she wouldn't have known much about until she met her husband. And that idea, she interweaves it with that idea of men striving for rights, human rights. It's your human right, your you know, your ability, or you're allowed to love. And with the plosives here, purely praise, passion, you can almost, it's like Bridgerton in a sonnet, isn't it? It's, it's very passionate, it's very sort of from the heart, it's very raw, I think, as well.
And I think that's comes from this idea of they are overly personal, these poems, because when she wrote them, they weren't intended to be published. This collection of 44 sonnets that she wrote were just meant to be private between her and Robert, which then obviously allows her to be much more personal in her writing and the things that she's saying. It wasn't until he then, once he'd read them and said, well, he's going to, isn't he, if he's in love with her, but he said they were the best sonnets in Shakespeare and convinced her to publish them. And then even then, she was a little bit embarrassed by the strength of the love that was coming across. So
the directness of the I love thee, the personal pronouns.
So they translated them as supposed translations from Portuguese poets. They were the sonnets from the Portuguese, so that sort of anonymity behind it, because they were so personal, and she maybe almost felt a little bit embarrassed by the strength of the love that she was showing through these poems, and particularly in this one. It's really, really poignant, I think, to be fair, to consider the context at that point.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at the sort of amount of religious imagery in the poem, she's kind of, there's a divinity to him, and then you can understand why she might feel that way, especially given the era.
Definitely.
Right, shall we move from that idea of sort of raw, passionate, undiluted love to cosy apologia?
Kind of the opposite, the IKEA of love.
No, I love this poem.
I do. No, it's my favourite. It is my favourite.
I think this poem's an absolute zinger, actually.
I think if Elizabeth Barrett Brownie is encapsulating the idea of somebody who's naive and has never experienced the world, this is the antithesis of that, isn't it? This is two people who are mature, they're experienced, they've loved others before. It's not their first love, but it is real love.
But I like the idea that similarly with Sonnet 43, she is using that time that she's got, because this is the hurricane one, isn't it? Where the hurricane Floyd is on its way, and she's got time to sit and think about her husband and sit and think about their relationship. And again, she's indulging herself, not quite in the same way that that Barrett Browning does, but in a much more sort of, I could pick anything and think of you, this lamp, this desk, this where you sit, the way you smile, that kind of thing, all those memories of love. But it's at least as valid as the feelings that Barrett Browning has.
I think if anything, it may be more valid because there's got longevity to this love. She's not celebrating this passion like they are, which seems almost quite immature in its love. It's almost like a lust in a sense rather than a love with Barrett Browning at this stage. Whereas here, it's the mundanity of their marriage, but actually it's the fact that it's mundane is a suggestion that it's not something boring, it's solid, it's something that is a foundation that's been built over time, and it's a really strong foundation.
And what a brilliant contrast between the divine imagery and
exactly. She's in a way she's doing exactly the same as
she's imbuing the objects with power.
She's elevating the mundane. She's elevating him to the divine. In fact, she says here, "We're content, but fall short of the divine." Line 24. There's still this idea of elevating the relationship.
She's
to that
real
same status.
about love. She understands that love. At the beginning, there's these violent, this violent kind of crescendo of emotion, but actually once that starts to kind of peter out, which it does, that violent sort of over emotion that you get at the start, and these crushes and all the rest of it, what is left is something that is much more tangible in the objects around you. And that's the truth. When someone passes away, for instance, that love that you have, it's represented in the objects. It's everything you pick up. It's those everyday objects. It's not just them you miss, it's the everyday. It might be the lamp that you bought together, chose together.
So it's the IKEA of the poetry. The wonderful IKEA's slogan is the wonderful everyday.
It's the attached. It's the memories and the emotion that's attached to those objects, isn't it?
Like the damp towel that's put on top of yours.
I really like how she uses the hurricane. This is our only American author in the anthology, I believe. Rita Duff?
No, Emily Dickinson.
Sorry. Okay, so one of our two American authors, and I think she was poet laureate in America as well. But I like how she uses the pathetic fallacy of the hurricane to kind of test the strength of their relationship. And like you said, everything in their house is solid, and even perched in the Erie in a position of potential danger with the hurricane, you get the opposite of the bunkered in yours as well. So I love the idea that Fred, who she dedicates it to, kind of is her anchor, and he holds her down, but in a really positive way. Like you said, it's if the Barrett Browning poem is the early stages and the crescendo and the extremely overwhelming feelings, like you said, this is what you're left with afterwards, which was a much more stable. And obviously you get a different structure here where she compares it to the teenage crushes. She calls the boys worthless. She uses words like senseless. I love the listing of the names, Marcel and Percy and Dewey.
And the fact that they're all bisyllabic, you know, that they're all given these kind of infantile names because the love isn't this.
And then you get Fred, so monosyllabic and solid.
Yeah, it's a solid name, isn't it? What I like about this is the fact that this poem, on the face of it, is not a love poem, but actually it's very much a love poem. And even, you know, if we're looking at the structure, for the first two stanzas we have an A-A-B-B rhyming couplet, which is typical of the love poems, the traditional love poems, and you only get that change after the volta in the third stanza, where things start to get thrown around and you've got a disruption. And it's that life will throw things at you which will test your love. But, you know, at the end of the day, by the end, the love is actually solid. We've got Do Blue You. We've actually got this rhyming sort of triplet going on, which is the, you know, whatever's thrown at us, however it's disrupted, we're still solid at the base.
Really clever little trick by a modern writer, that as well. It's really, I love that. I think it's
and
so
it just,
sweet.
you know, it just shows us that actually love is more than just gushing and cringy sort of.
They've literally built that house together and filled it with their lives, haven't they? And
well, this is a kind of love that sort of many people live and die having never experienced, and I think that she it's a kind of love that actually in popular culture is
panned a bit,
it's panned. It's a type of love that in popular culture is often portrayed as not good enough, or you know, and she's there's all this language of elevating, you know, astride a dapple mare standing in silver stirrups, and you know, you're bunkered in your area, I'm perched in mine. There's this idea, almost an image of two birds looking down, you know, sort of looking down at the sort of silliness going on below, and realising that, you know, they're lucky not to be involved in that anymore.
It's very tongue-in-cheek, isn't it? I think this is almost where you've got Elizabeth Barrett Browning maybe sort of in the midst of love, you know, in the heat of it all.
This is almost like a Mickey take of that in that first stanza, isn't it? With the knight in shining armour.
It's a Mickey take of the,
in a sweet
exactly,
way.
that chivalric love that, let's face it, we have all grown up to expect, and it's an unrealistic expectation.
Thanks Disney.
Mr. Darcy.
So, you know, this idea that your knight in shining armour is going to come along and rescue you, and you're the you know, the damsel in distress, or the, you know, and you need your prince to come along, and it's absolute. That's not how it works in real life. But she's not saying it in a malicious way. It's in a very tongue-in-cheek kind of way, isn't it? You know, it's not that he hasn't lived up to her expectations. It's that he's actually exceeded her expectations.
I mean, I love the whole, this bit, rhetorical question, when has the ordinary ever been used? And it's that idea, you know, you think about love poetry and love lyrics, it's all about, you know, that passion, that forbidden love, or the, you know, the meeting of two minds, and she's just saying, you know, like, you know, love is two people sat on a settee watching telly together.
Or twin desks. Like, I just love that they're both writers. A bit like Barrett Browning and Browning as well. It's like Barrett Browning and Browning 40 years later.
Or maybe 100, 240 years later.
I think they might be a bit cold and wrinkled by then.
I think there's still quite an interesting parallel between Sonnet 43 and Cosy Apologia with that line, line 25. Still, it's embarrassing, this happiness. And you look at that idea of how we were just talking about how in Sonnet 43 that Barrett Browning almost felt so embarrassed by the strength of her love that she anonymised them to be published and all that sort of stuff. And then, you know, Rita Dove is openly admitting that, you know, the happiness that she finds in her love for Fred is embarrassing, and it sometimes it's just like, you know, you just have to accept it, don't you? That's just how life is. Like, you know, we are quite mushy and sentimental at times, and it can be embarrassing, but we just accept it because that's what life is.
Yeah, definitely.
Such a lovely poem.
Yeah, it is.
I think that's a really good way into Valentine, because
Queen of segues.
we've had. Thank you very much. We've had sort of the ideal love, we've had the realistic love, and now we've got the sort of teetering on the dangerous, kind of like the good, the bad, and the ugly all sort of mixed up in together with Duffy. And I love Duffy's poetry because she's so raw and so honest. With how she tells things. I mean, she was criticised an awful lot when she first started writing poetry because it wasn't seen as literary enough. It wasn't seen as highbrow. It wasn't seen as sort of challenging or metaphorical enough.
Some of her poetry has since been redacted for apparently being too controversial. I would disagree with that.
Yeah,
but,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think she comes back to that idea of you're dealing with raw emotions, you're dealing with strong feelings. And not all of those are going to be comfortable. They're not always going to be something that you're going to want to read about, but they are valid just the same. So, okay, we start off with Valentine, and I don't know, what do we associate with Valentine's Day?
Oh, it's just absolute. It's a romp
All
fest.
those embarrassing
I
things.
absolutely
isn't it, that we
hate
just
it.
talk about.
I absolutely hate it with a passion because of the cliches, because of those symbols that are attached to it, and this expectation that one day of the year that person is your everything, and then the rest of the year there can be an absolute you know what, and then that one day of the year they show up with a cheap Tesco cards and a bunch of flowers, and it's forgotten.
I've never
It's
actually
just...
met anybody who buys Valentine's Day gifts. I don't know who's buying them.
Well,
who's
lots
buying
of
these
people
gifts?
clearly are. They
Yeah.
clearly
haven't
are.
worked for the other 364 days.
Yeah, and I think it's just that cliched is, oh no, it's Valentine's Day, on your way back home you stop off at the garage and get some
and
flowers.
what thought's gone into it? There's very little thought gone
Forget
into
to peel
it.
the price sticker on.
Yeah.
Well, not with Caroline Duffy, who's
No.
giving him an onion.
Yes, yeah.
So,
She's
anybody want
giving
to
him,
Unpick.
Unpeel.
Peel. Yeah,
Unpeel
we'll
the
peel
onion.
off the layers.
So, I mean, straight away she catches us off beat, which is what Duffy loves to do, right? And, you're opening a poem with the title Valentine, so you immediately have presumptions and preconceptions, which is what she wants you to do. And then she opens with a negative, which is obviously not what you expect. So not. I love that she opens with a negative not, because it immediately throws the reader off that positive love scent that they got from Valentine's Day. Not a red rose or a satin heart. And I hazard to say, possibly the most immortal line in poetry teaching. Kids forevermore will remember, I give you an onion.
Yeah, it's the onion
Yeah.
pattern, isn't it?
Yeah.
I've seen untold demonstration lessons where teachers have brought in bags of onions and it's all gone horribly wrong, and everybody's in tears by the end, whether metaphorically or literally.
One of my year 10s brought me an onion this year.
See, how
Afterwards,
romantic.
yeah, that was it. I hope it didn't have the same romantic connotations that Caroline Duffy was going on. But yes, there was just an onion on my desk
I
one
think
day. And it's like, yeah,
maybe we
okay,
could write a
thanks.
poem about how Mr. Steele is like an onion.
Are you trying to say I'm like an ogre? Because ogres have layers. Is that what you're saying?
I didn't say an ogre, I said an onion.
No, it's your aroma. No.
Brown and mildewy and in a darkened
Well, I mean,
cupboard.
yeah, when you
Thank
go
you.
down 1C, there is definitely
I don't come here for this bullying. No, I think when we're talking about, I know I seem to keep coming back to the other poems when we've moved on to another one, but I think we've done this in a very logical order, because you start with Sonnet 43, which is this really over-exaggerated positive look at love.
The
Then
stereotype
you've got,
of love.
Yeah, then you've got Cozy Apology, which is that realistic look at love, and then you've got Valentine, which is this over-the-top negative look at love.
Yeah.
This complete rejection of things and trying to sort of, really push forward those negative aspects of love.
Although
And-
equally obsessive, I would say. And the language becomes more obsessive as it goes along. You get the I'm trying to be truthful a line on its own. It sounds like an argument, and then later on, you get the imperative, take it, and obviously you finish on the word
I love
knife.
that bit where she's like, here,
You can literally imagine.
I give you an onion.
If anybody's
Have
watched
it.
Baby Reindeer, you can literally imagine somebody just shoving the onion at you. Take it.
Sending a text, I just had an onion sent from my iPhone.
I thought of
But then she goes on to sort of explain it. It will blind you with tears. I mean, what I quite like from a linguistic point of view is the modal verbs in this. You know, it will blind you with tears. Love will make you cry. It will make you cry for good reasons, for bad reasons, possibly. And then that idea of through those tears, you have that wobbling photo of grief. You know, that when you're looking at yourself, you don't necessarily see yourself as you are, but you see yourself through tears.
And there also feels to be quite an accusatory tone in those lines. It will make you reflect on a wobbling photo of grief, almost as if her lover, she wants her lover to feel grief.
Yes.
She wants her lover to reflect on what they've done.
Yeah.
There's a sense of sort of accusation there.
I think that's really compounded as well with the here, almost like she's addressing somebody that's, you know, that's there with her and we're not privy to who that is. And then she talks about how it will blind you with tears like a lover. You know, it's almost like it's directing it to someone. She's speaking from experience.
Maybe an interesting point, actually, that you know, all three of the chosen dedicated love poems in the anthology take the form of direct address as well. You know, they don't have to. Love poetry doesn't have to be like that, and yet these most effective ones position us, the reader, in that position of being spoken to, and therefore really in Duffy's case they make you squirm because it's so uncomfortable, and in the case of the other ones, they, you know, Cozy Apologia does make me a little bit fuzzy. I'm like, oh, I love that poem, it's so cute.
They're quite intimate, aren't they?
Just, in this one it is intimate, despite, you know, it's intimate just in a very different way, like you said.
My favourite line is the not a cute card or a kissogram. You look at the cacophonic sounds there, you know, she's really sort of rejecting those cute card, you know, or a kissogram. I mean, you often have to explain to kids what a kissogram is.
Yeah,
thankfully,
thank God.
they do not have those anymore.
I mean, is anyone sat around this table, were you alive when kissograms were a thing?
Yeah.
Possibly, yes.
Sorry, Miss Dawson.
Yes, myself and Miss Owen were definitely alive when kissograms were a thing.
I've not experienced one, thankfully.
No, but in the 80s they were. It was pretty much a guaranteed at anybody's, any man's 40th or 50th birthday party for sure. Sometimes even the 30th, and yeah, it was just
Do you want to explain what one is then?
So it is literally a person who dresses up in silly outfits, comes along to your party, sits on your knee and kisses you. A bit like, I was going to say something but I probably shouldn't say. But yeah,
I think I know what you're going with that one.
Yeah. But they can often turn up at work as well with flowers. So you would have a sort of a note or something, and they will give you a kiss and present the flowers. And the whole thing is incredibly embarrassing.
Well, actually being kissed by a stranger.
Yeah, kissed by a stranger. And,
maybe
passed on.
How does one get into that line of work?
Are you
Just thinking about alternatives to teaching.
I wish someone would do
Stick
that.
to the day job.
I wish someone would do that for me with like biscuits and an airbed. Like that'd be lovely. Just,
look at hobnobs.
There was a whole thing of like massage grams, wasn't there?
No,
really?
Yeah, just a little shoulder rub at the office, which is obviously
that's going
weird.
too far.
Oh dear.
That would be, that would
But
be too much.
speaking of the rejection of kind of classic images, so there's a cute card kissogram, and she does this all the way through. Is, you know, not a red rose or a satin heart as well. But even the more kind of nuanced ones, I think she even attacks people perhaps like Byron, who we'll come to later. It promises light. It is a moon wrapped in brown paper. You've got that really classically soft, gentle, pathetic fallacy image of the moon. The moon typically associated with romance because it was the kind of less garish, more secretive, when a lot of romances were conducted at night in secret, kind of association. She even takes those images down, the really kind of beautiful ones, a moon wrapped in brown paper. So that idea of covering over something that's a symbol of traditional love with something that's very domestic.
I like the idea with the moon as well, that idea that it's something that you can see but it's not obtainable. It's just always out of reach, significantly out of reach from what I believe. Just a little bit. And yeah, I think she...
And the platinum loops and the wedding ring. She takes every single stereotypical image of love that you can
like
think
that.
of.
I like that. It's platinum loops shrink to a wedding ring, if you like. It's just like that sort of, we could get married, like, I'm not.
I interpret it in a totally different way, and that's what's so great about poetry. I think that's like when you're trying to send a text to somebody and you're trying to sound nonchalant because actually you're desperately keen. So if you like, you know, because before she's just been like, take it. If feel like
A wedding ring.
yeah,
if you like.
exactly.
You know.
That's how I take it.
But you see, that's if we just go back a few steps to the line, it's a moon wrapped in brown paper. There's a real contrast there because the phrase brown paper sort of suggests a humility. You know, it suggests that, you know, she sees her relationship as something pure and humble and innocent.
It doesn't need dressing up.
Yeah, and contrasting with that word satin in the first line, it suggests that she sees their relationship as very pure. But actually, that's really at odds with the rest of the poem. There's a sense of that maybe she sees their relationship as more humble and stable than it really is, perhaps.
I love the ambiguity of it. I love how you could it could either be a super toxic relationship, or it could be more of a cozy apology, or it could be just kind of like, all this daft Valentine's
It's wild, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because without sort of knowing the intention, you're left to just guess, aren't you?
And that's what Duffy is brilliant.
But I think that
so
final
good.
line though, cling to your knife, that's the giveaway, isn't it?
It
It
is,
suggests if not an existing betrayal, it suggests that she expects future betrayal, or that the speaker expects future betrayal.
We see that in the line, or the lines, sorry. It's fierce kiss will stay on your lips, possessive and faithful as we are, for as long as we are. And this idea that, firstly, there's that subversion of the wedding line, isn't there, and then we've also got this idea that there's a realism that right now they're possessive, right now they're faithful, but that may not be permanent. And that's that realistic point of view, isn't it, that the relationship might not be perfect, and might not have, this longevity to it. It might be destined for failure.
That seems to be one of the big differences between the more modern poems and the more traditional ones, and I've talked to my group about that quite a lot. You can really see, I mean, obviously in Cozy Apology you've got literal references to the postmodern age, but in this one, for example, you don't really have that, but you can see in the structure of it on the page, the lack of rhyme scheme, the direct address, all that, you can see the kind of lack and the rejection of traditional approaches. And like you were saying about the knife line, Mr. Duffy loves a killer last line, quite literally in this case. That's one of her kind of typical calling cards as a poet. And it's quite nice to start recognising those differences, especially when you're doing your comparison. Like you can see a modern perspective on love, and you can see a much more traditional perspective on love.
Yeah, and it's interesting how the love that's more traditional is far more gushing, and you just think, is this because...
Is it real?
As well, we all are aware that much of, the kind of love that was celebrated at the time was forced love. It was people were marrying for convenience, and not long before this, you were literally marrying for convenience, and you were marrying for family benefit, and suddenly we're marrying for love, and that can be an overwhelming thing where you're allowed to, marry the person you choose, or you're able to do that. Whereas now we expect that. That's not anything out of the ordinary. Society has changed so much. 100 years ago, people, 150 years ago maybe, weren't living out of marriage as much, whereas now people are cohabiting and not getting married, and the expectations of love are different, the realities of love are different, and it's really nice to track how that is really tangible and reflected in the poems as well.
Actually, yeah, and because in the traditional relationships, they probably weren't writing the poems to their husband or wife. They were writing them to the person.
Well, Shakespeare was writing them to a male.
Exactly, yeah. So that's why the poems are so gushy, because that's the real object of their affection. It's the one they can't have.
Yeah.
And whereas now you can have the relationships, so the angle of the poetry is done a 180, and it's become more mundane as opposed to it being more fantastical.
Yeah. It doesn't make it any less valuable.
No, absolutely not. No, more so in some ways, but yeah.
Right, okay, so we've looked at our 3 core sort of love poems, if you like. Are there any others that you would sort of recommend that students could use if they were to write on the theme of love?
Should we go Manhunt quickly? Manhunt's a good one because it's obviously about relationships. Yeah.
Or did we do Manhunt under war poetry?
Yeah,
we did.
We did.
We did it under war poetry, and then very helpfully the exam board asked a question about relationships with it.
They named Manhunt. So it is literally a poem that it's split right down the middle in that regard. It could be war and it could be relationships.
Yeah.
We could take a look at She Walks in Beauty.
Yeah,
in
Walks
that
in Beauty.
sense.
I don't think we need to say more about Manhunt.
Forbidden love, love that is not necessarily just forbidden, but also should not be happening. It's definitely if you had to believe the rumours, this was written about his cousin's wife.
Yeah.
I fully believe the
And I
rumours
do.
because it's
Yeah.
Lord
So
Byron.
It was Lord Byron, and
It's a
let's
much
face
more
it.
carnal love, this one, I find.
Absolutely.
Isn't it? Yeah, rather than a...
Well, it's a love that is very much grounded in appearance and how
Yes.
she
Yeah,
looks, and
Surface level.
surface level love, that
Yeah.
lust basically.
It's all through
Passion.
like the male gaze, isn't it?
Yeah,
That I do.
absolutely.
It
Just,
is.
Yeah.
forcing us to look at a woman as almost, like an unattainable object.
Yeah.
That she's
Yeah.
she's so beautiful, and therefore she must be pure of thought.
But I think what I like about this one is that I don't like it. It actually makes me feel kind of queasy, this poem. But what I like about it is it's so sort of unabashedly voyeuristic.
Yes.
Like he doesn't even pretend that he has any connection to this woman, but
No,
that
he's not
tell
even
of
spoken to
yeah,
her,
that
so.
tell of days in goodness spent. He can tell that she's had a good life. He knows nothing about this woman, and yet he's talking about her like she's a
Yeah.
Her
divine
heart
being.
is love is innocent.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
How
absolutely
do you
wild.
know?
I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You were just saying about the voyeuristic sort of notions within it, and I like the idea that we're almost placed in Byron's eyes,
Yes.
and that she walks in beauty, that present tense. It's like
Yeah.
we are Byron watching her
And
walk
notice
across
how
the
now
room, and
it's not being addressed to her directly. He doesn't see her as somebody to speak to and address as an
No.
equal. It's a she, and suddenly you feel that removal, and like you said, you get that sense of the gaze, the possessiveness, the voyeurism, and it doesn't feel good to a modern reader. It doesn't
No.
feel
No.
natural.
No.
It doesn't.
It's
feel...
the equivalent of like a woman walking down the street and like
Yeah.
a man just going, oh, look
Yeah.
at you,
I said
Yeah.
that to my
Yeah.
class. I was like, when you're at a party and you see this girl you really like, and you're just like, oh, I've just got to
Yeah.
go write a poem
Yeah.
about her.
Yeah, it's kind of like the romantic version
Many
of
times.
Teenage Dirtbag, isn't
Yeah.
it? Like lyrically.
Right, yeah, but she's wearing a pretty dress, so it's all right.
It's fine.
Yeah.
what do we think about the sort of the use of night rather than?
So
like
we mentioned
those-
the moon earlier,
yeah.
didn't we? Yeah. So
Yeah.
that adds to that voyeuristic
It's-
quality, doesn't it?
So
Yeah, and
I
it's,
think
I'm
there's
spying
that
on her.
layer of mystery to it, like this sort of
Absolutely.
this lovely night woman.
a layer of mystery.
This
Woman of the night.
Why didn't he write that instead of any of this? He could have just put, "Oh, look at this lovely night woman."
Lord
it's-
Byron,
Yeah.
Mr. Steele, just right up there with each other.
Yeah,
I've been called Byronic in many ways, but not in my poetry.
that is not a
Well, as a very hedonistic individual in all manners, what Byron does employ is that chiaroscuro, so the blending of the light, the light and the dark. So it's an artistic term. If anybody does art, you've got the light and the dark contrasting each other. He'll have been a massive fan of art.
We use it in media studies
use it
too,
in media
for
studies
media
as well, we
children.
do,
and
absolutely.
film.
Yeah.
So chiaroscuro, light and dark contrast, and again, it's that idea that he finds something so tantalising about this woman, because she's this perfect mixture of the divine and the pure, and he sees that in her fair white skin. And then she's clearly a brunette, a dark haired
Raven
lady.
tresses.
Raven tress, and
Yeah.
her dress was even supposedly dark and sparkly because she was apparently in that period of mourning, which makes this even more inappropriate.
I think as well.
Sorry, Miss Dodd.
Yeah.
I'm going to invoke Mr.
Yeah.
Phillips here and channel the spirit of our dearly departed Mr. Phillips.
He's not dead.
This is the theme of the
He's
podcast,
not dead
isn't it?
yet.
I remember Mr. Phillips telling me that one theory was the idea that it's almost like Byron's dream of seeing her in this black dress and seeing her in the morning
Yeah.
dress, because he's imagining that his cousin has died,
Yeah.
and now he's got a free pass at this woman.
Ooh,
Yeah.
That's a Mr.
Yeah.
Phillips idea there.
Yeah.
I'm just-
If anybody's
like that.
seen the film Wedding Crashers and when they crash the funeral, I'm just getting visions of that,
Yeah.
of Will
I
Ferrell.
think we really need to update our cultural references at some point,
No,
don't we?
people need to experience that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right, speaking of this idea of voyeuristic, sort of watching women and sort of making assumptions, how about afternoons?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Philip
love this
Larkin.
one.
Relationship
Definitely a bit
poem,
voyeuristic.
because this one is quite complicated as well. I mean, it comes
quite
into
condescending, I find.
to relationships. I mean, women. Honestly, after you've been in your 20s, you're stuffed. Your beauty fades, and
Yeah.
you might as well just crawl back under the sofa and just
Curious to
with
assess
some ice cream and watch Bridgerton.
Yeah, curious to assess that was true of Byron's day, and it's still true now. How much have attitude's actually shifted.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
So, you peak, don't you? And then you marry, you peak, and then after that, love, that's it, your life's gone. It's all played through your children.
I don't think it's necessarily a critique of love. I think it's a critique of marriages of convenience. I think it's a critique of people who marry because they're expected to marry and have children because they're expected to have children.
And that makes sense when you think about Larkin. The fact that he was a famous bachelor.
Exactly. And I think that perhaps when Larkin... I think British society is in a different place now than where it was when Larkin wrote this poem. And I think we all have older relatives who are in relationships like this, who had children like this. And I think actually this poem's only really become outdated in the last decade or two.
And I'm going to be honest with you, I'm aware that Larkin is obviously, is treated like, is a raving misogynist and things. But I actually read this with almost an air of sympathy from him, where I feel
I do.
He is lamenting the life of those women. I don't think he is necessarily saying this is your lot in the sense that you're just going to have to make do. I think he's saying this is your lot, and actually it's not how it should be. This is what you to expect. And I think it's a criticism of how women are actually being, just cast aside, and
he doesn't seem to be enjoying. He doesn't seem to be
enjoying
what
I would agree with you on that. Because there are certain lines that do have an air of sympathy.
The hollows of afternoons and
behind them at intervals stand husband in skilled trades, an estate full of washing. Almost as if her husbands aren't always there. Almost as if this estate full of washing
the
is
men
all
are
they
out
have.
at work. And it's these generalisations, isn't it, that all young women, and it says young mothers, they're all doing the same thing at the same times in an afternoon every day. The men are out at work, they're at home, and they are just in this life, this cycle of getting up and doing the same thing day in, day out, and life isn't changing for anybody. They've all got these wedding albums next to their television, our wedding, rather than the naming of them.
And he recognises, doesn't he? He says something is pushing them to the side of their own lives.
Yeah.
That's not a voyeuristic.
No, it absolutely isn't.
I agree with you. I think it is sympathetic.
I like the fact he's saying something rather than someone, because he's recognising that this is a universal issue.
When he says something, he's talking about that general malaise that affects many couples.
I quite like it because it's this idea of, if you read any sort of Jane Austen text, it ends with a wedding, and there is that implication of a woman's life. And there you go. All the interesting bits done. We don't need to read, Pride and Prejudice, they get married.
If you watch
Disney,
watch any TV show, Bridgerton, Disney.
Yeah,
it
Cinderella,
always ends with a love story.
Sleeping Beauty. It always ends
what
with them
happens
going
7
off
years
into the
after that
married.
wedding? What happens 10 years after
Well, their
that
beauty
wedding?
is thickened. That's what's
Apparently,
happened. I'd like to see Cinderella sort of, after she's had 7 children. And her beauty has thickened, and maybe
but
Prince
that line, I love that line that their beauty has thickened. It's such an evocative line.
So
like you can like when I hear that line, I just picture that sort of feeling you get when sort of you look in the mirror and you look at a picture of yourself from 10, 15 years ago.
This
and
will happen
you don't
later in your lives.
It's quite strange that we're talking about this, because myself and Mr. Bruff were actually discussing this strangely at line-up today with the form. And we were saying how you look back at yourself 10 years ago and you don't recognise a lot of yourself. And certainly, as a woman, I can definitely say that when I look at photos of myself pre-children, I definitely think to myself, where did this extra weight come from? This is not the same person.
But you don't see the ageing happening, do you? It's only,
And it's that idea that these are young women, but actually they're aging quickly because they're being, they're married and having children so young that age is kind of creeping on them faster than usual. So it's quite sad. And then the idea that the beauty is thickened, society no longer considers them beautiful anymore. It's sad. Sad. So I really like this poem, and I do think it's one of my favourites, and I am going to stick up for Larkin. Generally I wouldn't, because I do think he's an absolute...
He can be a bit spicy.
Yeah. But I do enjoy Afternoons. I think it is one of his more realistic poems, and actually I think he has been quite sympathetic to the...
Well argued, Miss Dobbin.
Yeah.
It's good.
Right, okay. I think we've done a lovely spread there. I think there's definitely enough to sort of think about. So thank you very much. Shall we just end? So our
Word of the week.
Word of the week is actually the word of the week for the whole school.
Yeah.
And Mr. Steele is going to tell us about that.
Yeah, so actually, as we're recording this, the word of the week is currently arduous, you know, as in...
It has been an arduous week.
Well, it's been an arduous year, but we're in the final half term now. But by the time this podcast comes out, the word of the week for the whole school will be envisage, as in to picture something in your mind, as in 7 weeks' time, I envisage I'll be sat by a pool with a nice martini and the sun shining on my head.
Will you?
Probably not. Depressing. But it's nice to
But he
envisage
envisages
it.
Stop envisaging and start booking.
Instead, he will be.
Coddy won't pull off to Malaga already.
He'll be painting his shed and
Yeah, if Mr. Steele was writing a love poem about envisage, and it would be the pre-relationship sort of, you know, what you want it to be.
Yeah.
If you want an example of visage, it's in Ozymandias, isn't it? It's in
A
the
shattered
face.
visage lies a face.
Half
there we
sunk under
go.
that sand.
So a wonderful sort of link back to the poetry anthology.
And on that note.
Right, on that note, thank you very much to everyone who's taken part. I really appreciate it. And thank you very much for those people listening as well. And we hope you have a lovely rest of the week.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
you.